Hello, my name is John Endres. I'm the CEO of an organization called Good Governance Africa, based in Johannesburg in South Africa. We're very pleased to be in Brussels today, where we've been invited by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation to speak about the state of Africa and of South Africa and of developments happening here. We have enjoyed our interaction with our audience earlier here and look forward to our next few stops.
Frans Cronje, I work for a South African think tank called the IRR, a classically liberal organization and long-time friend and partner of the foundation. And very interesting afternoon in Brussels talking about South Africa and Africa and making the argument that while Africa seems, after decades, to be moving socially and economically in the right direction finally, there are at the same time questions being asked about South Africa and whether the political transition of the 1990s is something that can be sustained.
If you were able to give one policy recommendation, what should the EU do to support democracy in South Africa?
I think there's a big one, which is get in the game. And we've certainly tracked over our last decade that European ambassadors have been very guilty of skirting issues that we think are core to European and Western interest in South Africa, perhaps for reasons of political correctness, perhaps because of a very flawed reading of the South African government. I think that European ambassadors have made a series of critical strategic mistakes. And when we look at policy towards Europe today, the proposed cancellation of 13 bilateral investment treaties, that's a case of chickens coming home to roost. And there wouldn't for me be three. There'd be one major proposal, which is if you want your interest in South Africa to be defended, you need to start investing in the organizations and ideas that are the core of liberal democracies: property rights, individual rights, and the rule of law.
From an African perspective, I would say that development aid is less important than trade. And developed world governments, that includes the governments in Europe and the United States, give over $400 billion worth of support to the agricultural sectors every year. And I think that is quite a barrier to Africa's development. So rather than giving development aid, make it possible for Africa to trade with Europe more easily.
Welcome to the South African Civil Society Information Service. I'm Fazila Farouk in Johannesburg, coming to you this morning from the campus of Wits University, where I am to interview the university's Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Adam Habib, about higher education. And specifically, I'm going to be talking to him about higher education's role and contribution to transformation in South Africa. Professor Habib recently assumed his position at Wits University as Vice Chancellor on the 1st of June. Prior to this, he was at the University of Johannesburg as a Deputy Vice Chancellor. He's an acclaimed scholar, a professor of politics, and a very well-known public intellectual in South Africa. Welcome to Saxis, Adam.
Thank you very much.
Now, Adam, when I first approached you for this interview, I said that what I wanted to talk to you about was South Africa's transformation, higher education's contribution, particularly towards bringing about a fair and just society based on racial and economic equality. Is higher education doing enough to challenge the current status quo in the country? But before we get into that, one of the things that I read about you on your Wikipedia page is that your major influences are Karl Marx and Leon Trotsky. So I'd really appreciate it if you'd talk to us a little bit about that first.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. It's one of the big influences in my life. I mean, when I was in high school, I became politically involved largely as a result of the 1980 boycotts. And soon after qualifying, finishing matric, I became involved with the unity movement. And as a result of involvement with the unity movement, and then subsequently with the Workers' Organization for Social Action, and then subsequently with support work in COSATU, I began to get quite extensively involved with Marxist groups of one kind or the other. So Marx was a particularly profound influence, particularly in my undergraduate years at university. Trotsky himself was a large influence, at least the ideas of Trotsky were profoundly influential. I think he was one of the great Marxist theoreticians of our time, of the last 100 years anyway. And so I have been influenced by those ideas. Obviously, those are not the only ideas I've been influenced by. I've been influenced by other ideas, Keynesianism. Subsequently, I've been in management for a number of years and have had to deal with issues far more pragmatically than Marx or Trotsky had to. And so I have been influenced by other ideas. But those ideas profoundly about notions of equality, notions of creating a society free of oppression and exploitation. Those ideas stay with me today. I mean, the question is, how do we do those things in a contemporary era? And one of the other influences that have emerged more recently is the notion of Antonio Gramsci and how you work in contexts where the environment is not facilitative of non-exploitative relations, what kinds of reforms you engage in that will allow for a transformation to happen. And those thoughts clearly influence me in my current role, but also in much of my ideas and much of my engagement in contemporary South African politics.
So then, getting to the nitty-gritty of this interview, then what role do you think higher education can play in South Africa's racial and economic transformation?
Look, I think higher education can play a fundamental role, like education more generally. I think it can fundamentally equalize the playing field. But that assumes two things. Firstly, it assumes that higher education is not simply the preserve of the rich, that it is also the preserve of the talented across both rich and poor communities. And that is a big thing to suggest, because higher education takes about 17% of our young people. It absorbs about 17%, which means up to 83% of people are not in a higher education. And so there's a big challenge here. 3 to 5 million people are standing in street corners with no skill sets, no jobs, and no access to higher education. And that's a big challenge. And so when Bladin Zibande says that he wants to grow the FET sector, I think strategically he's spot on. I think it's absolutely
FET, further education and
further
training.
education and training sector. And I think he's spot on. It's absolutely central to us being able to effect transformation. Ironically, if he succeeds in doing that, South African capitalism can thank the General Secretary of the Communist Party, because you would have addressed the Achilles heel of the South African economy, which is its skills deficit. And so that's the first big thing, is yes, higher education can play that role, but it's based on the assumption that higher education can take on is not simply the preserve of the rich. The second assumption it makes is that higher education is adequately financed. Because what you can provide is access to the broad base of young people. And that's what the entire continent of